This is the story of my complicated relationship with my older sister, Dove. At 29, she harbored an intense disdain for me. She made it clear that she couldn't stand my existence, and it often felt as though she resented my very being. According to her, I was leading a life I didn't deserve, one that, in her view, wasn't meant for someone like me. But the irony was that while she judged my life harshly, hers was spiraling out of control, making her bitterness all the more incomprehensible. Dove's life had been a series of failures, many of which she brought upon herself. After her divorce, she moved back into our parents' house, having failed to secure a job or finish college. She had dropped out to pursue a relationship with a wealthy boyfriend, a man who eventually dumped her when she showed her true colors. It was a pattern I came to recognize in her behavior, one of recklessness and entitlement. Growing up, my relationship with Dove was never harmonious. She was the golden child, the pretty, smart, and popular one. My parents showered her with praise, and it always felt as though she could do no wrong. Her beauty and charm were constantly acknowledged, while I was often left in her shadow. People would rave about her looks, while I just existed. That sting of comparison cut deep, and over time, it fostered a deep sense of insecurity in me. Dove used that insecurity to her advantage, often digging into me with cruel remarks. She would tell me that nobody liked me, that I was ugly, or that I was never good enough to be a part of her world. These comments, made when I was just a child and a teenager, wounded me deeply. I often felt invisible, ignored, and as though I could never meet the expectations of my parents. They were always more focused on her achievements, and her popularity, while I was the one left to navigate the world alone, quietly retreating into myself. I did everything I could to distance myself from the toxicity that surrounded my sister and my parents. It became clear to me that they would always take her side. They never really stood up for me, even when Dove's actions crossed the line. She had free reign in our household, and as a result, she often terrorized my space. I had my own room, but she and her friends would often invade it, leaving it a mess and making it clear that my personal boundaries didn't matter. There was one time in particular that still sticks with me. I had spent weeks working on a school project, only for Dove and her friends to destroy it one afternoon while I was away. It was an effort to ruin me, and I was on the verge of failing the assignment. I wanted to tell my parents, but I knew it would be pointless. Dove had already blackmailed me in the past, and she knew how to manipulate everyone around her. When I was 14, she threatened to share unflattering pictures of me with my classmates unless I kept quiet about her behavior. I was terrified. Her power over me felt suffocating. Telling my parents would only make things worse. I already knew they wouldn't take my side. They never did. As I grew older, I began to recognize that my sister was more than just a mean-spirited older sibling. She was a narcissist. It had taken me a long time to come to terms with that, but looking back, everything made sense. Her behavior was not just a phase, it was who she was. Her relationships were a perfect example of her inability to truly connect with others. She was a serial cheater, someone who could never be faithful because she was always chasing something or someone better. She was also a gold digger, a fact that became more evident as she dated a string of wealthy men, only to discard them once they no longer served her purposes. Dove's life as a teenager had been nothing short of toxic, and as an adult, she was no different. The years didn't seem to change her. She continued her destructive behavior, and my parents, especially my mother, continued to enable it. My mom never disciplined Dove, no matter how bad her actions were. It was as if Dove could do no wrong in their eyes. It frustrated me to no end, but eventually, I realized that I needed to focus on myself and stop worrying about someone who would never change. Things started to improve for me once I got out of high school. I worked hard, putting in the effort to get into my dream college. It wasn't easy. There were plenty of challenges along the way, but I eventually achieved my goal. I earned a degree and landed my dream job. It was one of the happiest moments of my life. And in the process, I met Atlas. He was smart, kind, and incredibly handsome. I met him at an office conference, and we instantly clicked. It didn't take long for us to start dating, and once we did, our relationship grew stronger with every passing month. We traveled together, went on spontaneous dates, and made lasting memories. I had finally found someone who truly cared for me, someone who appreciated me for who I was. As our relationship progressed, Atlas became a significant part of my life. He was close with his family, and I was introduced to his brothers and parents fairly early on in our relationship. On the other hand, I was hesitant to introduce him to mine. My hesitation wasn't about being ashamed of him, far from it. It was because of Dove and the toxicity she brought to every situation. I knew that if I introduced Atlas to her, she would somehow find a way to ruin everything. She had always been the center of attention growing up, and the thought of her meddling in my life made me anxious. Atlas didn't pressure me about meeting my family. He understood my concerns, especially when I told him about the dynamic between me, my parents, and my sister. He was patient, but after over a year of dating, he started to grow suspicious of my reluctance to introduce him to my family. So, after much thought, I decided to tell my father about him. Dad was happy for me and invited us to dinner. I was both excited and nervous. I had been holding off on introducing them for so long, but now that the moment was here, I wasn't sure how it would unfold. I was especially concerned about Dove's reaction. She was unpredictable, and I knew that if she saw Atlas as a threat to her position in our family, she would do everything in her power to sabotage it. In the days leading up to the dinner, I made it clear to Atlas that my family dynamics weren't ideal. I didn't want him to be blindsided by my sister's behavior. He said he would handle things, and we moved forward with the plan. Then out of the blue, Dove called me. It was unexpected because she never called me, especially not to chat. She seemed curious about Atlas, asking me questions about him, and when I would be visiting home. I could tell that my mom had probably spilled the beans about my relationship, and Dove was now trying to cozy up to me. Her sudden interest in my life seemed disingenuous, and I knew she was only trying to gather information to use against me later. I was now even more wary of introducing Atlas to my family. It felt like taking a huge risk, one that could backfire. I had a nagging feeling that Dove's intentions were not pure, and I wasn't sure if it was worth the trouble. At the same time, I couldn't keep hiding Atlas from her forever. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that it was time for him to meet my parents, regardless of the chaos that Dove might stir up. After a while, Atlas asked me if I wanted to go for a walk and give him a tour of the neighborhood. Before I could respond, however, my sister Dove stood up eagerly and said, "Sure, I'd love to." Her voice was light, almost too eager, and I couldn't help but notice the surprise on Atlas's face when he heard her. He glanced at me, clearly hoping for a more intimate moment between the two of us, but Dove wasn't one to be easily deterred. She smiled brightly, almost arrogantly, and said she'd go with him instead. Atlas, taken aback by her sudden insistence, hesitated for a moment, but then let it go. He just wanted to get outside, to clear his head, but he had been hoping for some quiet time with me. Still, he politely nodded in her direction, conceding to Dove's enthusiasm. His discomfort was evident, but he didn't want to cause any drama, especially with the tension that had already been brewing. Dove, on the other hand, didn't seem to pick up on the awkwardness. She flashed me a quick, almost triumphant smile before walking outside with him. I stood there for a moment, feeling my stomach tighten. There was something about Dove's behavior lately that was starting to make me uncomfortable. She was always quick to insinuate herself into situations where she didn't belong, especially when it came to Atlas. I wasn't sure whether it was innocent curiosity or something more calculated, but I knew this wasn't the first time I had seen her act in such a way. She had been manipulating situations to keep Atlas close to her for years, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. It had only been a few days since Atlas and I had arrived at my parents' house for a visit, and I could already feel Dove's old tactics resurfacing. She had never been particularly fond of me, and her jealousy of my relationship with Atlas had always been apparent. I had watched, over the years, as she pulled every trick in the book to try and get his attention. The thought of her attempting to undermine our relationship, especially now, filled me with anxiety. But despite my fears, I trusted Atlas. I had to. He had always been upfront with me, and I had no reason to believe he would ever betray me. Still, I couldn't help but feel a gnawing uncertainty in my chest. I decided to watch from a distance, silently observing how Atlas would handle the situation. I needed to know how far Dove would go this time, and, more importantly, how Atlas would react. Update. Hello, everyone. I'm engaged. Atlas proposed to me last month during a beautiful trip we took together. Yes, he went down on one knee with the most perfect ring, and I couldn't stop gushing over it. It was a moment I'll never forget. After the proposal, things seemed perfect, but that's when Dove began her usual game again. The moment I returned from visiting my parents, I could feel her re-entering my life, trying to worm her way into Atlas's world once more. It started innocently enough. Dove began texting Atlas regularly, asking how he was doing, even though we were together most of the time. She had always been the type to make everything about herself, so it didn't surprise me when she bombarded him with texts about nothing important. What had caught my attention, however, was the fact that she seemed to know exactly what Atlas liked and how to manipulate him. Atlas was a cat lover, and I knew that Dove wasn't one for animals. She had never shown any interest in cats, but once she learned that Atlas adored them, she quickly adopted one herself. From that moment on, she began sending him videos of her new cat, cute clips of the animal doing silly things, hoping to win him over with her new hobby. At first, Atlas was polite, responding to her messages, and sharing his own love for cats. But over time, the messages began to feel more like a ploy. Dove had always been able to feign interest in things that weren't hers to draw attention to herself, and now she was doing it again. For a while, Atlas would show me her desperate messages, always acting as if they were nothing. He would laugh at her antics, shaking his head, but I could sense his discomfort. Eventually, he stopped sharing her messages with me. I assumed that he had grown tired of her antics and had simply chosen to ignore her. But when I checked his phone one evening, I found something that made my stomach drop. Dove had added herself to Atlas's social media accounts, and she was liking and commenting on every single post. It wasn't just the recent ones. She was going back through his old posts from years ago, liking pictures from 7 to 10 years ago. The cute heart icons she used on every comment made it clear how desperate she was to get his attention. I could feel my anxiety mounting, so I decided to check his messages. I found that Dove had been texting him nonstop. While most of the messages were unread, there were a few that stood out. They were strange and unsettling. She seemed to be trying harder than ever to get his attention. My heart raced when I saw there were missed calls from her, including one at 3 a.m. That was when the real panic set in. I confronted Atlas about it, and he immediately seemed nervous. He assured me that he had been ignoring her messages and calls, but when I asked about the missed calls, he couldn't avoid it any longer. He explained that one night, Dove had called him in the middle of a personal crisis. She had been upset and began talking about some traumatic experiences related to her past with Jeremy. She needed someone to talk to, he said, and he had simply listened to her. But he also told her that it was inappropriate to call at such an hour and that she should have gone to her parents for support. While I appreciated that Atlas had tried to help her, I couldn't shake the feeling that he should have told me sooner. Hiding things from me was not something I was okay with, and I made it clear that this situation was starting to make me lose trust in him. I didn't want to be one of those women who blindly trusted their partners, only to get hurt later. I had seen too many stories where husbands fell for manipulative tactics despite their best efforts to resist, and I wasn't about to be made a fool of. I demanded that if Dove ever called him again, he was to immediately hand the phone over to me. I wasn't about to let her weasel her way back into our lives without consequences. Not this time. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. One night, her call came through again. I had been half asleep, but when I heard Atlas's phone ringing, I didn't hesitate. I answered it, my heart racing. At first, there was silence on the other end of the line. Then, Dove's voice finally spoke, sounding awkward and caught off guard. She quickly claimed that she had dialed the wrong number and hung up. I was furious. The next day, I repeatedly tried calling her to confront her, but she never picked up. So I took matters into my own hands. I texted her from Atlas's phone, demanding that she stop texting and calling him at inappropriate hours. I made it clear that if she had any real concerns, she should reach out to me, not him. After that, she seemed to back off. At least for a while. Update 2. After Atlas proposed, I was on cloud 9. But Dove's persistence seemed to know no bounds. She must have seen the picture of my engagement ring that I sent to my dad because shortly after, she began texting Atlas again, sending him those same ridiculous videos of her cat. I was done with her at this point. I couldn't believe she hadn't learned her lesson yet. When Atlas finally told me about her attempts to worm her way back into his life, I couldn't hold my anger back any longer. I called Dove and let her have it. I yelled at her for trying to manipulate Atlas, for attempting to sabotage our relationship, and for disrespecting both of us. She was silent for most of the call, but I didn't care. I was done being polite about it. I had had enough. Little did I know, this would only make things worse. As soon as I hung up, I got a call from my mom. Her voice was sharp, filled with anger. She accused me of insulting Dove and told me I was being cruel to my sister. She claimed Dove was struggling with depression, still recovering from her traumatic divorce, and that I needed to be more understanding. It was laughable. Dove had never shown any signs of depression, let alone the kind of emotional turmoil my mom was describing. But my mother didn't want to listen to reason. I told my dad that if they continued to defend Dove's behavior, I would cut them out of my life. I wasn't about to be manipulated by my own family, and I couldn't continue to tolerate Dove's toxic presence. I had to draw a line somewhere. Update 3. I never imagined it would come to this. Dove had always made my life miserable, but I never thought she would stoop so low as to try and seduce my fiancé, especially not just days before our wedding. All the bullying, the body shaming, and the mind games were one thing, but this was another level entirely. She was trying to destroy everything I had worked so hard for. Atlas and I had been planning our wedding down to the smallest detail. The excitement was building, but I wasn't talking to my mom after the confrontation. Still, she called me one day to apologize for her outburst. She said she had been scared for Dove, who had been having panic attacks. I knew better than to believe her, but I let it slide. At that point, I was focused on my upcoming wedding and didn't want to let Dove's antics ruin the final stretch of planning. Everything was set. The day of the wedding arrived, and we were busy getting ready at the venue when I received a call from Atlas's best friend. He asked me to come to Atlas's room with my parents immediately. I teased him at first, saying that Atlas couldn't see the bride before the wedding, but his tone was serious, and I could hear the urgency in his voice. Something was wrong. I rushed to Atlas's room with my parents, heart pounding in my chest. When we arrived, the scene before us was almost surreal. Atlas was lying on the bed, shirtless, barely conscious, and his groomsmen were surrounding him, explaining what had happened. Dove had arrived in Atlas's room earlier that day, offering him a drink. Atlas had refused at first, but she insisted. After just one sip, Atlas began feeling dizzy and disoriented. He excused himself to the washroom, and that's when everything went downhill. Dove had spiked his drink. As he stumbled back into the room, partially passed out, Atlas's friend had arrived just in time to capture the aftermath. Dove had tried to make advances on him, undressing herself and attempting to seduce him while he was disoriented from the drugged drink. When Atlas's friend caught her in the act, she tried to cover up, pretending it was consensual. But the evidence was undeniable. Everything had been recorded. When Dove realized she was caught, she smirked, unashamed, and warned Atlas's friend not to tell anyone. But the damage was done. Her plan to destroy our wedding had been exposed. My parents were livid, and so was Atlas's family. Dove had gone too far this time. My mom tried to call her and confront her, but Dove came to the phone with smudged lipstick, claiming that it was mutual, that Atlas had been the one to push her for a one-time hookup before the wedding. My mom slapped her hard, telling her she was lying through her teeth. It was over for Dove. She was kicked out of the venue before she could make another scene. The security was instructed to keep her away from the premises. A doctor confirmed that Atlas's drink had been spiked, and he was lucky that he hadn't been completely incapacitated. The wedding was delayed as Atlas recovered, but when he finally walked me down the aisle, I knew that no one could ever take away what we had. I was marrying the man I loved, and nothing, not even Dove's schemes, could change that. When we returned from our honeymoon, my parents visited us to apologize for everything that had happened. My dad assured us that Dove would no longer be a part of our lives. He had kicked her out of their house and told her to find her own place to live. As much as I appreciated the apology, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly avoided disaster. If Atlas's friend hadn't recorded what happened, I might have never believed that he was innocent. The whole experience had shaken me to my core. But at least now, Dove was out of our lives for good. Thank you for watching this video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit notification bell to stay updated.